when Eve commits the sin and eats the apple, God comes looking for Adam, not Eve.
Yep.
So God's like, hey, you're the leader. What are you doing?
Yeah.
Hey, welcome back to the Men of Iron podcast. I'm Ryan. I'm here today with Colton. And this month we are tackling topics that apply directly to men. We're going to tackle a couple tough topics. And our goal is to just speak into things that are meaningful to you as an audience, just dealing with what men deal with. So the topic today is kind of broad. What does it mean to be a man?
Yep.
And we got to start there because we have to define that to be able to bring some context to the other conversations we're going to have across the course of this month.
Yeah, I think like this topic is hot. Sometimes a hot take in culture, right? Which is kind of wild to even think that.
It's kind of wild, yeah.
Even from like the position that we sit in of like, we kind of define a man from what the Bible says.
Yeah.
But culturally bringing it back out, people are like, what is a man? And like that question. And in my mind, it's even sometimes hard for me even to get there because like, I know what a man is. I'm following God. I'm reflecting who Jesus is. Mm-hmm. But that gets twisted nowadays. Like that's not a thing.
It's interesting. I've been having a lot of conversations with pastors recently, just talking about how Men of Iron is going at their churches and like they're running mentorships, running small groups, whatever. And a lot of times it comes up that it's sort of a controversial decision today to intentionally invest in men. And it seems wild to me that in church, that's a tough decision to make. And now, not every church is having a hard time with that decision. But even starting with the point that it's like controversial to invest in men, and that's a real thing.
Yeah.
How did we get here?
Yeah.
Why did we get here? And of course we're going to talk about what it means to be a godly man, but let's start with just kind of hashing out like what does culture say and why is it a controversial topic?
I think men have slowly started to take the back seat. Let's get real into it. Mm-hmm. Like I feel like they've really started to take a back seat in just culture, but also as leaders of their family, leaders in the church, and they're just like they're just kind of along with the flow. And that's not the way God designed them to be. Like men aren't designed to be backseat drivers. Like they want to speak up when they feel like they have the right answer, but they need to get up there. They need to be leading properly. They need to lead their family properly, and they need to lead their as a maybe in the leadership position at church. Like they need to step up. And men sometimes as a culture, we just like, well, everyone else will handle it, and I'll just come along for the ride.
It's interesting. Just because you're partnering with your wife, and I recognize not everybody's married, so like that's going to apply just to our married guys, but just because you're partnering with your wife does not mean that you're not leading. And sometimes partnering does not mean that you're following. So I think scripture is pretty clear that like the man is intended to lead the family and lead the church, but that doesn't mean that we lead in spite of our wives, our partners. I think we've gone through this period of toxic masculinity. I think we've come through a period of men being blamed for a lot of things. Now, that'll be clear. Like a lot of men got blamed for things that they actually did deserve to be blamed for. But it produced this kind of hesitancy to recognize something that has always been true. That is that culture is healthiest, communities are healthiest, families are healthiest, churches are healthiest when men are healthy and caring for the people that they're leading. So we're not promoting toxic masculinity. We are promoting biblical masculinity. So we don't want you to be a guy that is overbearing or just forcing people to go the way you want them to go. That's not right. But the answer to addressing those problems is not to just shy away from investing in men altogether. It's very common to find churches. You can just go to a church, and obviously like we do more than church things, but I'm using church as an example. Like you can go to a church website, and a lot of times you can click the ministries tabs, and it's like kids men, for teens, for young adults, for women. That's it.
Yeah.
It's like, man, how are we investing in men? Like, what are we calling men up to? So I do think it's something we need to rediscover. And I think it's something we need to reinvigorate. And I think Men of Iron can be a huge part in that.
I like that last part right there that you were saying about like, we need to rediscover it.
Yeah.
It's always been there.
It's always been there.
It's always been there. And I think like guys have a hard time like putting their finger on it. Like, where does that start? Like, how do I like, we talk about like being a man. Like, where does that start?
Yeah.
Like, where's the root of that begin so we can actually like build out of that? Like the Bible tells us a lot of things about it. But I think like if you want to like summarize it in a whole, we're just trying to reflect Jesus. Like, what did Jesus do? Like, if we want to talk about like he led his disciples, he was a leader. You know, he talked about how he loved people. He gave people grace, gave them mercy. Like we think of that as like almost maybe sometimes as a weakness, right? Like you think, oh, that's a weakness of mine as a man, but actually it's a strength. And you can lead that way and you can lead properly that way.
Okay. So I'm going to push back slightly.
Do it.
One of the things that we've done as a culture through this fear of toxic masculinity is we actually have turned Jesus into somebody he wasn't. And so a lot of times you'll see Jesus represented. There's a pastor that I like to listen to that talks about Jesus was not like a slobbery boyfriend. He was actually like a super passionate, strong leader. That's kind of what you're talking about. And he actually did some fairly controversial things that we tend to just gloss over when we're talking about loving, compassionate, gracious Jesus. And don't get me wrong, super loving, compassionate, and gracious Jesus, but did some pretty direct things that are kind of forgotten. So like Jesus marches into the temple when the people in the temple are financially taking advantage of people that want to approach God, right? And he just destroys the temple tables. One gospel actually talks about him driving people out with a whip. That's not slobbery boyfriend Jesus. Like that's like, hey, this is wrong. We're going to address it and we're going to fix it. Now, obviously, I'm not giving a prescription that's like, hey, you know what good leadership is? Whips and fighting people. Nope. He drew a line when he needed to draw a line, and he called people out when he needed to call people out. He actually stands in front of Peter right after he tells Peter, like, hey, on this rock, I'll build my church. He shortly after that says, get behind me, Satan. You don't know what you're talking about. Yeah. So like Jesus is direct. Yeah. He's not afraid to lead. He's not shy about what his mission is. And at the same time, gracious, loving, compassionate. I mean, he's given second chances to people who don't deserve it. Yep. He's extending grace to people who have never known it. But at the same time, he can hold the line. And I think that's one of the interesting things that we're dealing with in our culture today, where we're like afraid to call men up. So we only highlight these like soft aspects of Jesus. And at times, I mean, sitting here in this chair right now, like it feels like it could be controversial to be like, hey, don't forget, he actually called people out. Yeah. He drove people out. Like he was direct. He was a leader, like a real leader.
Why do you think, like coming back for you, like thinking this through, like, why is it so important to be direct as a leader and as men to be a leader that way? Because like it can get washed in there a little bit because it's a balance too.
He read the room, right? He read the room. Yeah. And when he could see that people were 100% wrong, it's like, hey, you need to fix this. Yeah. You need to solve this. And he, like, I think about the story where he, the woman caught in adultery. Yep. So that's John 8. So he extends grace to her. So like these guys catch her in sin. They're super sketchy dudes in the first place. They're just trying to get an upper hand on Jesus. They're using this woman as a tool to move their agenda forward. So that's toxic. Yep. This woman is thrown in front of Jesus and he extends grace to her. He says, hey, like, you know, whoever has no sin, go ahead and cast the first stone. The old guys get it. They're like, okay, we're out of here. Yep. And most likely they're pretty sketchy dudes to begin with. But he tells her like, hey, you know, grace has been given to you today. Go and sin no more. So it was not this mushy thing. It was a direct thing. Yep. It was like, hey, you're wrong. Sure. I'm going to extend grace to you, love you, care for you, want the best for you. You got to stop. Yeah. And a lot of times we compromise on that. And I think it is a healthy, manly thing to be spiritually wise, to be discerning, and to support people when they need support and confront people when they need confronted. Is it challenging to balance those things? Of course it's challenging to balance those things. But I think, you know, we're talking about what it means to be a man. Culturally, we've kind of stepped away from some of those hard things. Yep. And I think you can see the results of it. I mean, like we recently have been talking about fatherlessness in the United States. Those numbers are skyrocketing. It's very becoming more and more common for dudes to just walk away from their kids, from their families. That's not good. Like we got to be direct about that. It's very common for me to talk to pastors in churches and them to recognize the fact that like, man, it's really hard to get men to serve in the church. It's really hard to get men to invest in this community. That's not cool. Like, we need to fix that. So there are real challenges, and we have to address them.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this episode of the Men of Iron podcast. As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another. Our Strong 27 mentorship experience was designed for every and any man who desires accountability, balance, and spiritual growth. We believe one-to-one mentorship is the most effective form of mentorship. Strong 27 requires a 12-month commitment with 2 meetings per month, providing you with the best opportunity to know God and know your purpose. Go to menofiron.org and start your mentorship journey today.
What do you think are some steps? Like, we talk about this as a whole, we kind of paint this picture, right? But like, if I'm a guy out there and I'm trying to figure out, like, I did step away, I am in that back seat.
Yeah.
Like, I'm living that kind of life and I recognize it. Like, what are some things that I can do practically? I think of like you were saying a little bit, like, be direct. Mm-hmm. Like, you got to have that balance in there. But like, let's make it more practical. Like that's sometimes a little pie in the sky. But like, what's something that I can do? Like, today I hear this pod, tomorrow I'm making this change. Like, what does that look like?
Let's start with what voices are you listening to? Mm. And so when you talk about masculinity, it's a huge topic in the world, right? There's plenty of, you search any podcast on masculinity, you're gonna find a bunch. It's radically important that you're listening to the right voices. And we're an organization that wants you to grow in your faith first. It's like, we want you to know Jesus. And so you want to be listening to voices that are going to teach you what it means to be a godly man, a godly leader. There are plenty of people that are going to tell you that men are strong, that men go after what they want, that men fight. Like, yeah, okay. Like, there's times when you need to do that. And I'm not shy about that. First and foremost, man, you need to go after your relationship with Jesus. Yep. You need to grow as a godly man. I'll tell you what, like a man that is manly without being godly, that's dangerous and it's hurtful. And I think that is some of what we're walking through as a culture. I think we're seeing some changes, but I think it's important that you're listening to the right voices. And so, like, those voices, like, what are they? I think you need to find godly voices. Yeah. Men who understand the Bible, men who understand the character of God, men who understand the ministry of Jesus, and that want to stand for those principles and invest in you. And honestly, I guess we'll dive into this. Like, I don't want to be a man that's just manly. I want to be a man that's godly. Yep. And so, like, there's any number of traits that are stereotypically manly traits. I'm like, yeah, I love a good football game. We're recording this weekend. The Steelers lost the Eagles, so I don't love that. I like to go hunting. Yeah. I like to shoot stuff. I can build some stuff. I can work on cars. Like, those are manly traits. But if there's not godliness in there, what is that? Yeah. And if you don't do that, that doesn't mean you're not, like, that's silly. Yeah. So I think it's important to go after godliness first, and then use the gifts and talents that God has given you to build His kingdom. I think that's one of the more manly things you could do. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think faith is a huge piece of that. And also another thing is, like, getting around the right guys as well. Like, you got to build a support system. Sometimes we're like, guys, we got to be the lone wolf out there and we're taking on the world by ourselves. And like, to that point, like, we go to the extreme of that masculinity. Like, I'll do it myself, right? Like, I'll take on the world by myself. But actually, like, this just came in my mind in this thought, like, Jesus put 12 guys around him. Yep. Like, Jesus built, like, a small crew to go out there and, like, change the world, and He was pouring into them. So, like, we can't take away, like, if Jesus is doing this and building other guys up and had them a part of it, like, why did He do that? Like, that's a thought.
And I think that's one of the things that culture is going to tell you, like godless culture is going to tell you, do it yourself, be stronger, be faster, be smarter. Those aren't bad things. Yep. But if they're detached from godliness, like, what is that? Yeah. I don't want to live for that. I think it's a great point that Jesus surrounded Himself with people. A lot of times, if you dig into those disciples and who they were and who spent time with Jesus actually had, like, Him and 3 first, then Him and 12. A lot of guys will make the case that then outside of that 12 is like Him and 72. So He had this clear, really tight knit group, and then a group that was kind of extended, like the typical 12 disciples. Yep. And then even outside of that. So they were speaking to each other. They were investing in each other. They were challenging each other. I mean, just read through the Gospels. You'll see they said some crazy stuff to each other, actually. because I think they were struggling with trying to figure out what it means to be a man. Yeah. And I actually, that's hit me right now. Like a great thing to do is just read the Gospels and see how Jesus led men to be men. What did he do? What did he ask them to do? He gave them challenges. There's times where he said like, hey, we're going to work on expanding and growing the kingdom. I want you to go out on mission, pair up in twos and go do it. That's it. He's like, don't take a bunch of stuff. Like, just go with God. Yeah. You need each other, and you need the Spirit of the Lord moving in your life. That's godly leadership. That's godly manhood. Yeah. So read those Gospels, see what he did. And it doesn't take long. And you can see from the Bible what Jesus did.
Yeah. I think like that piece right there is like that lone wolf piece culture.
Don't do it. Yeah.
Yeah. Culture puts you onto that. Like, you got to do it yourself, tighten up your bootstraps and go after it.
Yeah.
And I think it's so important too. Like, I know we talk here a lot about it at Men of Iron, but like getting into mentorship and being paired up to have that guy to personally pour into you, because you got to keep your cup full. You can't run on E. Like, no car runs on E. You can't run on E.
Yeah.
So to have someone that keeps you accountable is super important, but also gives you the words of wisdom when you need them, and to be able to pour into you and say, that's right, that's wrong. Hey, do this, do that. Like, to be able to be that person that can hold you accountable in those situations, to be able to help you grow as a man. Like, we have to be able to grow. Like, we can't just be like, well, I'm a man, that's what I am. Now, there's a growing process in there. And that change will happen throughout time through the influences that you have in your life. It's like you're saying, the voices. What voice are you listening to?
Yeah.
What's that look like for you? Is it the correct voice? And to be able to understand and have someone to be alongside you to make those steps in your faith, talking about having the right friends around you. Like, what's that look like? And making sure that we can take those proper steps as men of God.
I think our mentorship is super strong. Obviously, we're very passionate about it. I would say what we tell men is we want you to be a man who knows God and knows your purpose. Yeah. We believe that you're called to thrive in your core 5. That's your faith, family, friends, fitness, and finances. I think it's super strong. That's like, sure, it's a product pitch. Like, if you want to get involved in that, we can help you get involved in that. But actually, like, we believe in this model, and it's sharp. Yep. You got to be strong in your faith. If you're wavering in your faith, it's going to be very hard to find strength in the other areas. So if you're a guy that's listening to us right now and you're like, man, I don't know God, and I honestly, I'm struggling to find my purpose. That's okay. Like, we get that. We talk to guys like that all the time. Yeah. Reach out. Like, we can help you. And one of the cool things I think about what we do is we're not going to be super directive with you. We're going to pair you up with somebody that might be a season or two ahead of you, and can intentionally invest in your life and help you to grow in your faith. And as you grow in your faith, you're going to find that you're making progress in your family, friends, fitness, and finances. And so, you're not going to find a Bible verse. It's like, and Jesus said, thrive in your core 5. That's the model that we've developed. It's the model that we care very much about. We care about it because we've seen that it's effective. And if you're a guy that clicked on this, was like, man, what is a man? Like, we can help you figure that out. And I'll tell you right off the top, that's what it is. You need to know God, know your purpose. You need to thrive in your core 5. If you don't know how to do that, if you feel like you could be sharper in any one of those areas, reach out to us. We'll help you. There'll be a link here in the description. You can click on it. You can get in contact with us. You can probably get in contact with Colton directly. Yeah. And we'll help you. I mean, we're on this journey too.
Yeah.
It's on my mind today that there's a couple decisions that I did not hit the mark on, where I probably needed to be a little bit more of a godly leader. Maybe that sounds more scandalous than it should. But we're growing too. Yeah. And we want to be the men that God has called us to be. And I think we're on the same journey. So it's not something where it's like, we have this figured out and you need to get it figured out. We want to help other men grow and be godly men. Of course, we want to push back on the lies in culture, and we can help. We can make a difference.
You told a story in our peer group a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
And you were talking about this faith piece.
Yeah.
And how, like, diving into faith is kind of like the navigator for everything else in life. And like, we keep talking about like knowing your purpose, and like, we find that in the scripture. That's where we find that. We find that in the word of God and in our faith. And how actually in faith it helps lift up those other things. Because you can kind of sometimes cloud like, well, if I know Jesus more, will it actually help the other things? And that's a hot take. Like, will it actually do that?
So go ahead.
And and just thinking that through, like, maybe share a little piece of that, and then, but just like, why do we say that? Like, why do we say like no more? If you know your faith better, it's going to help lift those other things.
The story you're referring to is like when I was like 19 or 20, I worked for this guy at this camp that I was new at. So I was like figuring out when you're a young dude, you're 19. I was out on my own for the first time, just like the whole world trying to figure out what it means to be a man. I was trying to learn. I was working and I was off for the weekend. And I was trying to learn how to play guitar. And my boss at the time, his name was Art. He was like, "Hey, just wanted to tell you, you're gonna be able to learn that pretty quickly." Like out of nowhere. I was like, "Well, I'm struggling here, and I'm not sure I am gonna learn that pretty quickly." He's like, "No, I'll tell you what." He's like, "When you work here, you have to take your faith seriously, or you won't be successful." And the whole thing was we were working with young guys that were in trouble. It was a faith-based thing. So like what he said was true. You definitely had to take your faith seriously. You had to be crying out to the Lord all the time for help in really tough situations. He's like, to work here, be successful here, you have to take your faith seriously. He's like, what you'll find is as you take your faith seriously, other things are going to come a little bit more easier to you. And full transparency, I did not believe him. I was like, that's not true. And even today, talking about it, like when I shared it to peer group, I was like, man, and sharing it now, I'm like, I have found it to be universally true.
Yeah.
In seasons of my life that are difficult, there will be things that want my attention, that they seem like things that I've got to figure out. And they're true. Like you got to figure them out. Sure. But when I have intentionally taken my faith more seriously to try to address that situation, it has always been wiser. And I have always been more effective. I believe because I'm asking God to help me be the man that he's called me to be, and recognizing that I'm not a lone wolf and I'm not some stereotypical manly man that's going to come in and solve it. Like I need God to solve it. And I'm not, sometimes I get like I'm not guaranteeing that your life will be easy and soft and simple and you'll be wildly successful and everything. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I have found that when I'm struggling with something and I go to God for direction and wisdom, it has caused those things to be easier to handle. And you guys might be dealing with crazy, significantly difficult things. I think if you go to God, it might not solve it overnight. It might not take the pain out of it. But I think you'll find that your relationship with the Lord, as you grow it and strengthen it, it will help you deal with those other things. So that's that faith first concept. I think it's really strong. I think it's really important. It's one of the reasons we are not going to compromise on that. Like, so that's why we're saying, hey, what's it mean to be a man? You gotta be a godly man. Yeah. If you're not a godly man, you're just like a tough dude.
Yeah.
And you don't want to just be a tough dude.
No, I agree 100%. And I think those pieces is something like when we talk through like those small bits of like taking your faith seriously, like you're saying, it'll help you in other areas. But also I think it gives you light to other areas that you didn't see before.
Yeah.
And you're actually just really taking your faith serious is like inviting God into your life, and not like it's salvation. I'm talking about inviting him in on a daily basis to help you with each situation you're going through, to give you maybe the grace for that situation or having the patience for that situation. But like you were saying before, to also be able to make a decision. Like sometimes we got to make that decision and be able to take that step forward. And it may be a tough decision to be able to cut something loose or
for sure
maybe lead properly in a situation of not telling someone how it is, but putting your foot down and being honest, because you're a leader. You're leading your home. You're leading, in leadership at maybe your job. But I think all those things come in balance. And that's why I think faith is so important. And it really drives that. If you're trying to really be that man and be that front, get up front seat and stop being in the back, like it's time to be able to take that seriously and move on.
God has called men to be leaders. Yep. And that means we do have to make tough decisions. And that means that we do need to stand up for what's right. And that's not universally always easy. But when you're walking with God, you're almost guaranteed to be making the decisions he's called you to make. And certainly there are Christian men that miss the mark. That's part of this whole toxic masculinity piece. Like there's plenty of Christian men that have missed the mark and influential pastors that have missed the mark. And I don't want to ignore that or sidestep that, but I would bet you that as they're in the process of missing the mark, their relationship with God is decreasing. And they might not be upfront about it, right? They might be in a dark spot or something where they're not telling the truth about what's going on. But I think it would be very difficult to find somebody who is actively engaged in growing their relationship with Jesus and also making horrible, toxic decisions. I don't know that exists. I think there are guys that let their faith lapse and they see other areas of their life lapse. And sometimes it's a small impact, like just one family. Sometimes it's a huge impact, like hundreds, thousands of people. One thing that can be helpful just to kind of bring this conversation to a close, I think, when I think about what it means to be a man, I think about the first man. So Adam, right? Like God made Adam. And if you really want to dig into this, go back into Genesis. There's only a couple of chapters. You could read Genesis 1-3 and see, like, what did God make Adam to do? And what's interesting is day one, like God makes Adam out of dirt, breathes life into him. So he's like filled with the breath of God, and God gives him a job from the top. Like, hey, I built this incredible creation. I want you to care for it. So like men have worked since day one. What's interesting about his work is it wasn't complicated. It wasn't difficult. He didn't sweat, I don't think, until sin came into the picture later on. So Adam was made to do the Lord's work, to care for what God had created and enjoy that work. And while he enjoyed that work, he thrived in his relationship with God because he was daily walking with God in his creation. So I think we are created to care for what God has entrusted us with. That's what a man does. And a man takes that responsibility seriously. And part of that is walking with the Lord. That's what men have been made to do since men have been made. Yeah. So we care for what God has entrusted to us, all of us. We walk with God daily. That's what we're made to do. And later on in the story, Adam says, hey, this work's pretty tough. And God's like, I need to make you a suitable helper. And he creates Eve. And Adam works together with Eve to care for the things that God has entrusted him with. So we work together with the people around us. Many of us, we work together with our wives to complete the task that God has given to us, always giving God the glory, always moving his mission forward. That's what a man is.
Yep. And I think that piece right there, just kind of a final thought for myself, is this thing of like, we just came off that series of wives.
Yeah.
And to hear their story, their side of it, like they're walking alongside their husbands that have been going through stuff.
Yeah.
And helping them out and being that helpmate to them. And it's like putting the right people around you, as we said before. And like, we're always striving or always trying to hit the mark right as guys. But make sure that you lean into those people, whether it's your friends, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a mentor, whether it's your wife. Like, lean into those people to allow them to help you, because God created Eve for a very specific purpose, and to see that she could come alongside Adam and really help, and to be able to help take care of what God entrusted to Adam to do. He still was leading. He was still leading the whole time.
When Eve commits the sin and eats the apple, God comes looking for Adam, not Eve.
Yep.
So God's like, hey, you're the leader. What are you doing?
Yeah.
So I think that's incredibly important to recognize that. Like, a lot of times it's the joke, like, well, women brought sin into the world. It's like, actually, God confronted Adam first, saying, like, dude, what are you doing? So we need to be healthy men. We need to be godly men. When you miss the mark, you can course correct. It's not the end of the world. But keep God first in your life. That's the only way to know how to be a man, is to be the man that God's called you to be. That's it.
Okay, I love it. I think that really, to kind of set this series off right, that really does it for us. And just thinking that piece through on like the basis of it all, because then we can build upon that. If we can understand what God created the man to be, we can only build from there. Like, that's the building block for it.
All right, guys, that's the episode for today. We'll see you back again next week. We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening to the Men of Iron podcast. Be sure to like, subscribe, and share. At Men of Iron, we exist to change a culture one man at a time, and we'd love to have you partner with us. So go to menofiron.org to see how you can get involved, or donate at menofiron.org/donate.